It was a Saturday night, well past midnight, and I had just finished visiting my brother in a small town a couple of hours away. I don't usually make long drives that late, but I had promised to come by, and time got away from me. The weather didn't help either. Thick fog blanketed the highway, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Highway 47 is a desolate stretch of road, mostly surrounded by dense woods on either side. During the day, it's scenic and peaceful, but at night it feels like something out of a horror movie. No lights, no gas stations for miles, just an endless winding road. It was the kind of night where every shadow seemed to move, and every sound outside the car was amplified. I wasn't in a hurry. I was just hoping to make it home before I started nodding off. The mist swirled in front of my headlights, and the steady rhythm of the rain against the windshield only added to the eerie feeling creeping into my mind. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a figure, barely visible, walking along the side of the road, drenched by the rain. I slowed down as I approached, and sure enough, there she was, standing with her thumb out, waving me down, her pale face just barely illuminated by my headlights. I'm not the kind of person to stop for hitchhikers, but something about her struck me as different. She looked desperate and alone. I hesitated for a moment, but the longer I stared, the guiltier I felt. She couldn't have been more than 30, maybe a bit younger, soaking wet and shivering in the cold. It didn't seem right to just leave her out there. I rolled down my window and called out, "Do you need a ride?" She nodded and approached my car without hesitation, her movements slow and mechanical. I unlocked the door and she slid into the passenger seat without a word. Her wet clothes clung to her thin frame and her long dark hair was matted to her face. I noticed her breathing was shallow and labored. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She turned to me, her eyes wide and glassy like she hadn't slept in days. "Just down the road," she whispered. "Not far." The way she said it made my skin prickle. Her voice was hoarse, almost like she had been crying for hours. But I shook it off, telling myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. I glanced over at her again. Her hands were resting on her lap, fingers slightly trembling. But she didn't say anything else. I decided not to push her. The silence between us was deafening. Every so often I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following us. The fog seemed to press against the windows, closing in, and every bump in the road sent my heart racing. My mind was on edge. We drove in that suffocating silence for maybe 15 minutes when she suddenly spoke again, her voice barely audible over the rain.
"Can you pull over here?"
I hadn't seen any exits, no houses, no signs of life, just thick trees and the winding road ahead, but she insisted.
"Please, I can walk from here,"
she said with a low tone. I slowed the car, pulling over to the side where the shoulder barely existed. The trees seemed closer now, almost looming over us, their branches curling like fingers in the mist. She opened the door and stepped out without another word, vanishing into the fog. I sat there for a moment, watching the shadows swallow her. Something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. A big one. I wanted to call out, tell her to come back, but she was gone. A heavy pit of unease settled in my stomach, but I started driving again, hoping the feeling would fade. It didn't. A few miles down the road, my gaslight flickered on. I cursed under my breath. There wasn't supposed to be a station for another 20 miles or so. But then, almost as if on cue, I saw the faint glow of neon in the distance. A gas station. I hadn't remembered there being one here, but I wasn't going to question it. I needed gas, and I needed a break. I pulled in, the station eerily quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. There was no one at the pumps, and the convenience store looked deserted. The lights were on, but I didn't see an attendant. I filled the tank as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The fog pressed in from all sides, and the quiet was unbearable. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the back seat. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned, slowly, to get a better look. The back seat was empty, but the blanket I always kept folded up back there, it was gone. My mind raced. Did she... No, I had locked the doors when I got out. Right? I must have. But as I checked, my blood ran cold. The doors were unlocked. I practically jumped back into the car, locking the doors, gripping the wheel until my knuckles were white. I just needed to get home. This night had been strange enough. I started the car and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I noticed something else, the faint smell of damp earth and rainwater coming from the back seat. My breath hitched. I glanced into the mirror again, and there she was. She was crouched behind the passenger seat, her face hidden by her wet hair, but I could see her hands, those pale, trembling fingers, gripping the seat in front of her. I slammed on the brakes, my heart thundering in my chest. I whipped around, but the back seat was empty. Nothing. Just the lingering smell of wet earth and cold air seeping into the car. I didn't stop again until I got home, and when I did, I ran inside, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, when I finally had the courage to check the car, I found the blanket, soaked and crumpled on the floor of the back seat. But it wasn't mine. I stared at the blanket, confusion and dread mixing in my stomach. It was a deep shade of green, soft and familiar, but I had never owned anything like it. My mind raced as I tried to remember if I had seen it before. Then, with a sudden jolt, I realized it wasn't mine at all. It belonged to my neighbor. She had borrowed it a month ago and I hadn't seen it since. So how did it end up here, crumpled in the back seat of my car? Had the hitchhiker taken it? Or had she been hiding in my car longer than I realized? My mind raced with questions. I felt like I was losing grip on what was real. How had she gotten into my apartment without a sound? Who was she? A lost soul needing help or something far worse? How did she manage to sneak into my car and my apartment without a sound? Was she even human? The questions churned in my head, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe. Whatever had happened that night, whoever, or whatever, had been in my car, it had left a mark on me. I could feel it, an unshakable presence, lingering just out of sight, waiting. And whatever it was, I wished to never experience that feeling again. It was a cold autumn night, and I was driving home after my late shift at the hospital. The roads were empty, and the steady hum of the rain on my windshield was almost hypnotic. I was eager to get home, but I still had a long stretch of quiet country road ahead of me. It was always eerie at night, especially with the fog creeping in, but I kept my focus on the road. As I turned a sharp corner, my headlights caught something unusual, a family standing at the side of the road. They were huddled together, a man, woman, and a little girl, all soaked to the bone. The man waved frantically, signaling for help. My gut reaction was to keep driving. Something about it didn't feel right, but they looked so desperate. What kind of person would leave a family out in the cold and rain? I pulled over and lowered my window just enough to speak. "Do you need help?" I asked. The man stepped forward.
Our car broke down just up the road. We're trying to get to town, but there's no signal out here.
His voice was steady, but I could see the exhaustion in his face. The woman stood behind him, clutching the little girl tightly. The child's eyes met mine, wide and anxious. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. "I can give you a ride to town," I offered. They thanked me, piling into the back seat. The man sat next to his wife, the little girl between them. As I pulled back onto the road, the car was eerily silent, except for the rain pounding on the roof. "So where's your car?" I asked, trying to break the tension.
Just a few miles back, we've been stranded for hours.
The man replied. His answer didn't sit well with me. This road wasn't heavily traveled, but surely someone would have come by before now. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught the man staring at me. I quickly looked back at the road.
"We were trying to get to my sister's house. She lives in town,"
the woman added with a soft voice. I nodded, keeping my eyes ahead, but something felt off. The little girl hadn't said a word. She just sat there staring out the window, her small hands gripping her mother's coat. Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared behind us. The car was moving fast, too fast for these roads. My heart skipped a beat as it got closer. The family in the back seemed tense, their eyes fixed on the approaching car. I glanced at the man. Do you know who that is? No, he said quickly, his voice tight. Just keep driving. The car behind us was practically tailgating now, its high beams glaring in my rearview mirror. I sped up, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Is someone following you? I asked, the anxiety creeping into my voice. Please, just drive faster, the man pleaded, his voice trembling. The headlights were blinding now, the car behind me so close it could have touched my bumper. I floored it, the engine roaring as we sped through the foggy night. The car behind us wasn't letting up. It was keeping pace with every move I made. What's going on? I demanded, glancing back at the man. His eyes were wide, his face pale. They're after us, he whispered, more to himself than to me. What? Who? Before he could answer, the car behind us suddenly swerved to the side, pulling up alongside my car. I caught a glimpse of the driver, a shadowy figure wearing a hood. My heart pounded in my chest as the car lurched closer, threatening to run us off the road. Pull off! Pull off now! The man shouted. I veered onto a narrow side road, my tires screeching on the wet pavement. The pursuing car followed, its headlights cutting through the fog like knives. The little girl finally spoke, her voice soft but terrified.
Daddy, are we going to be okay?
Of course we are, sweetheart, he said, though his tone betrayed his fear. I sped down the dark, unfamiliar road, my pulse racing. The road was narrow, lined with dense trees, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. The car behind us wasn't backing off. It was relentless. Suddenly, the man leaned forward. Take the next left. There's a place we can hide. I didn't question him. I turned sharply onto a dirt path that led into the woods. The trees loomed over us, and the path was barely visible in the dark. We bounced along the uneven ground as I tried to put distance between us and the car. The headlights from behind disappeared into the fog, and I finally slowed down, my hands shaking. We should be safe here, the man said, though I wasn't convinced. I turned off the car, and we sat in silence, the rain tapping lightly on the roof. I could barely breathe, my heart still pounding in my chest. Who were they? I asked, my voice trembling. The man hesitated before answering. People we've been trying to avoid. What do you mean? I turned to face him, but the look on his face chilled me to the bone. They weren't after us, he said quietly. They were trying to save you. I blinked, confusion washing over me. What are you talking about? The little girl giggled softly. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The woman smiled, but it was cold, sinister. You see, the man continued, we weren't stranded. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone kind enough to stop. I stared at him, my stomach dropping as the realization hit me. No. The man leaned closer. You should have kept driving. In that moment, I understood. The car chasing us wasn't trying to hurt them. They were trying to stop me from making the worst mistake of my life. The family I thought I was helping wasn't running from danger. They were the danger. I fumbled with the door handle, but before I could open it, the man's hand was on my shoulder, his grip unnervingly tight. There's no need to go, he whispered. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. I froze as the man's icy hand gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging into my skin. Don't be afraid, he whispered, his smile unsettling. The woman in the back seat was also looking at me and smiling. My heart pounded in my chest. Without thinking, I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the fog, slipping on the wet ground. Behind me, I could hear them calmly exiting the car, their footsteps slow and deliberate. You can run, the man's voice called out through the mist, but it won't change anything. I pushed forward, crashing through the trees, the branches scratching at my arms. The forest was thick, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear them, always just behind me, moving at their own pace like they knew exactly where I was going. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens cut through the night air. Hope surged in me. I sprinted toward the noise, breathless and terrified, praying the police would reach me in time. I burst out of the tree line and stumbled toward the flashing lights. The officers rushed over, pulling me to safety. "There's a family," I gasped, my voice shaking. They were chasing me. The police searched the woods, but after what felt like forever, they returned empty-handed. "There's no one out there," one of the officers said. "But we did find something. A car, overturned and rusted. Looks like it's been here for years." He described the vehicle, and my blood ran cold. It matched the description of a family that had gone missing on this very road over a decade ago. A man, a woman, and their daughter. No one had ever found them. I stared at the officer in disbelief, my body trembling with fear. Whatever had been in my car that night, whatever they were, whatever had happened to them on that road all those years ago, I wished I had never stopped and won't do it again.